The MRF Summit was established by SWANA and ISRI to bring together brand owners, recycling companies, and their customers, along with local government, to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing in the recycling programs in the United States and Canada.
What's happened over the last year with China's actions has exposed some vulnerabilities and some challenges with the current recycling infrastructure as it relates to the residential stream. We have issues with regard to the quality of material that is coming through the stream and our ability to process it and upgrade it. And it's important for all the stakeholders in the stream to come together and talk about these challenges and how we address them.
The MRF Summit should be attended by everyone with an interest in preserving recycling systems in the United States and Canada. This includes those people who collect the recycling, the people who work at MRFs and other recycling facilities, as well as the brands and other manufacturers that purchase recycling material. Of course, state and local government officials should also attend so they can stay current on the challenges facing recycling operations and programs.
Well, I think it's important for all of us, not just the municipalities or the recyclers, but to understand what's happening throughout the chain and the role that each of us play. And also what the vulnerabilities are that we each have and what the strengths are as well that can be leveraged to work together.
China's new waste import policies create opportunities for recycling programs to look anew at how they recycle and what the specifications need to be for a recycled product. In addition, it's an opportunity to look again at how we measure recycling success and figure out whether the current system is best for America and Canadian recycling programs.
Our hope with regard to this MRF Summit is that attendees will walk away with a much better understanding of what's happening today in the market with regard to recycling, and specifically what are some of the challenges, a better understanding of the challenges, as well as the opportunities, and how we can work together to solve these issues.
We look forward to seeing you at the MRF Summit, co-located with WasteCon in Nashville, Tennessee.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our MRF Summit Kickoff and Keynote panel. The MRF Summit is a collaboration of Institute and Scrap Recycling Industries and SWANA in an effort to bring all the stakeholders of the recycling industry together to discuss the current disruption and begin to find new solutions. We'd like to thank our MRF Summit sponsors, Republic Services and Resource Recycling Systems. Now, please welcome our host for this session, Arturo Santiago, editor, MSW Management Magazine.
Thank you, and good morning again, everyone. Again, my name is Arturo Santiago. I am the editor of MSW Management Magazine. I'm also the managing editor of Forrester Media. Let's see, I also play shortstop on my co-ed softball team, if that means anything to anyone. Legally, I have to say that my suit and shirt are by Calvin Klein. The tie is Original Penguin, belt is by Kenneth Cole, and my shoes are from Nordstrom Rack. So, there you go. Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here today to help kick off day 2 of WasteCon 2018 and the start of the MRF Summit. Now, we do have a lot to talk about this morning. The disruption, as you all know, that we're seeing in the recycling markets is unprecedented. But before we get into that, I do want to introduce the panelists that we do have here today. Robin Wiener leads the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, Inc., ISRI, in Washington, D.C., which represents approximately 1,600 private for-profit companies in approximately 36 countries. Stephen Sikra is the Associate Director of Corporate Research and Development at Procter Gamble. He's responsible for P&G's global solid waste strategy and driving end-of-life innovations. And we have David Biderman, the CEO and Executive Director of SWANA, and he's also been a leader in the solid waste industry for more than 20 years. Also, I've been told if there's time at the end of the session, David has prepared a little soft shoe number for us. Only if there's time. All right, so relax, David. We will be taking questions via Slido. To me, that sounds like a water park ride, but it is a real thing. All you have to do is go to slido.com, enter the event code SWANA, and submit your questions. Now, this is a pretty cool thing. You can also vote on other questions that are submitted by attendees, and that'll help move that question up to the top of the list. So, with that, we're going to start by each of you giving us a quick overview of who you're representing on this panel. And Robin, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. Thank you, Arturo. And before I start, I want to thank SWANA and all of you here today for joining us for this very important MRF Summit. I don't think it's any secret to anyone here in this room that the recycling industry is currently undergoing a transition. And therefore, it's more important than ever that all of us, municipalities, haulers, recyclers, MRFs, brand owners, manufacturers, end-use consumers all come together to discuss the various issues that are affecting the recycling systems today and try to work together to solutions. So we're grateful that you're here. And let me start, for those of you who aren't familiar with ISRI, giving you a very quick overview of who we are. We are the US-based, the Washington, DC-based trade association representing the scrap recycling industry. We have members all over the world in more than 40 different countries, but 80% of our members are based here in North America. Our mission is to promote safe, economically sustainable, and environmentally responsible recycling through networking, advocacy, and education. And we do it for all those companies that are processing what we consider the traditional scrap commodities, ferrous and non-ferrous metals, paper, plastics, tire and rubber, textiles, and of course, electronics. So now I've been asked to start this panel so I can set the stage and share with you some of the dynamics that have gotten us to where we are today. Now, in order to do that, I think that there are three key principles with regard to recycling that it's important that we talk about or be aware of to help set the stage. There are certainly more elements to the recycling industry, but these are the three that I think are very key to understanding what's happening in the recycling industry today. First, it's important to know that recycling is bigger than the bin. That's the phrase we use to indicate that the amount of recycling that's occurring in the US and that the private for-profit recycling industry is involved in day in and day out includes both residentially sourced material as well as industrial and commercially sourced. And it's the industrial and commercially sourced material that makes up the majority of the stream. It's approximately 70% of the stream. And that material essentially or generally is source separated. So there aren't the contamination issues that we see in the residential stream, the remaining 30%. Second, it's important to understand that recycling is demand driven. It doesn't matter how much or how good the residential recycling collection system is and how much volume is collected if there's no market at the end of the stream. It's the market that drives successful recycling. And the ISRI specifications are key to that market. It's the ISRI specifications which have been in place for more than 80 years and used globally, and even adopted by a number of governments around the world, including the Indian government in their customs codes, that specifies what the end markets need. And there are literally hundreds of grades of scrap that are developed by having the buyers and sellers work together to define what are the allowable tolerances. And I like the word tolerances and prohibitives and outthrows a lot better than I like the word contaminants. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The third important principle to understand is that the scrap industry is a global industry, and this long predates China. In any given year, more than 800 million metric tons of scrap are consumed by manufacturing industries the world over. We like to say that scrap is the first link in the global recycling chain, in the manufacturing supply chain, because It's estimated that between 40 and 50% of the raw material needs of manufacturers are met through scrap each year. And about 180 million metric tons, so a significant percentage of that 800 million, is actually crossing borders regularly in order to flow to where the manufacturers need that material. So it is very much of a global trade. Now, the US and China are the key players in the market and have been for many years. The US is a significant part of the chain because we are the largest exporter in the world. There is a surplus of scrap in the US, more than domestic industries can consume. In any given year, between 30 and 40% of what we process into specification-grade material is shipped to industrial consumers, paper mills, foundries, plastics formulators, et cetera, the world over. Literally more than 150 different countries worldwide. But China is by far our largest customer and has been for more than 20 years. They've been consuming more than 30%. And last year alone, China consumed more than 43 million metric tons from scrap exporters around the world. So you can see why when China makes a change in its policies, and as dramatic as they did this past year, it affects the global market and certainly all of us here in the States. And you can see, and I'm sorry it's in small print, but since the beginning of this year, exports of plastics out of the US have decreased more than 90%. Copper and paper exports, nearly 40%. Aluminum, 20%. And ferrous, the least affected until now, 5%. And this is only the first 6 months of the year. And I would assume that the numbers as we go through the rest of the year are going to significantly, they're going to get much larger. Because a lot of the policies that China put in place actually didn't take effect until March or April of this year. And this is just a quick chart to show you that over the last 25 years, we've shipped more than 300 million metric tons. So let me quickly just show you this. China is the trigger that exposed a lot of the weaknesses in the recycling systems, especially in the residential, but it's not the only. And I know I think I've run out of time, so I'll be very quick. What I've listed on this slide are all of the various steps China's taken over this last year to affect the industry. Happy to answer any questions later. Of significance also is the fact that it's continuing. We've got the US-China trade war. We have the latest tariffs that have been imposed on Turkey. So imports coming in from Turkey, which we now have a 50% import on steel. So the ferrous side of the industry is getting hit hard. We're also seeing impacts in the Southeast Asian market, where there's been a flow of material to compensate for what's happening in China. So we're reaching capacity in those markets. And there's been a number of domestic challenges as well. The bottom line is we all need to work together. There is no panacea. There isn't one fix that's going to return us to where we were. China's not coming back. We need to strengthen markets here and overseas. And I look forward to the rest of our conversation this hour, but also during the next 2 days. So thank you. David?
Thank you, Robin. I would like to add my thanks to Robin for welcoming everyone here, and I'd like to say a special thank you to the ISRI members who have come to the MRF Summit and to ISRI staff for working with the SWANA staff to put together this great event. So as I'm sure many of you know, the past 12 months have been very challenging for recycling operations, scrap yards, and local governments. I don't think many of us anticipated all of the dramatic, ongoing, and evolving impacts of China's waste import restrictions. Revenue is down, costs are up, processing lines have been slowed down. Some material is being stockpiled. I've seen the pictures. Some material is going to landfills. Local recycling programs are changing, often shrinking, and there's great uncertainty about the future of recycling in many communities. So how did we get here, and what can we do about it? That's why SWANA is working with industry to hold this MRF Summit. National sword and subsequent actions by China, as well as more restrictions imposed by other Asian markets, has driven home the fundamental need for everyone in the domestic recycling supply chain, from the individual generators to the collectors, from the MRF operators to the municipalities and the counties, including the purchasers of recycled material and, importantly, the manufacturers of containers, to work together collaboratively to address these challenges that are facing recycling programs throughout North America. Not crisis, challenges. It turns out recycling is quite confusing for many of us. As you can see on the slide, people don't know exactly which bin things are supposed to go in. Candidly, most Americans don't know what plastics 3 through 7 means, or that greasy pizza boxes go in the trash and not in recycling. We frequently put the wrong thing in the recycling bin, or we put a recyclable container that has food in it, or a soda can with soda in it in a recycling bin. There are many wishful recyclers who place plastic bags, hoses, dirty diapers, and lots of other icky stuff. Icky stuff is a defined term, icky stuff, into the blue bin. The result, as we know, is contamination. The widespread use of single stream led to increased participation in many communities, but also increased confusion and increased contamination rates, which are often reported in the 20 to 25% rate, and that doesn't include glass. Unfortunately, what single stream did not lead to was an increase in consistent education and outreach to correct the aspirations of wishful recyclers. When China finalized its stringent import standards at the start of the year, the result and impact was dramatic. Paper, dramatic. Paper and plastic piled up along the east and west coasts. In a few states and provinces, processors were temporarily permitted to send recyclable material to a landfill. However, the invisible hand of the market began to work a little bit and stabilize the system, and Southeast Asian countries such as Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, as well as India, began to accept higher rates of recyclables from the US, replacing China to some extent. Prices stabilized, but at lower levels than in previous years. But over the past few months, the waste and scrap sector's China problem has received local, national, and international media attention. Recyclables have become part of the growing trade dispute between the United States and China. Chinese tariffs are being imposed and are scheduled to take place tomorrow. Robin mentioned the tariff issues that we have with Turkey. China is also proposing a complete ban on what it calls imported waste that will take effect soon. We all need to work together. We will need to all work together to overcome these new significant challenges, to ensure that robust local recycling programs continue and, more importantly, thrive. It's going to require innovation. It's going to require change. It's going to require compromise. And without a doubt, it's going to require more money. Most of all, though, it's going to require your active leadership, input, and involvement. We need your best ideas on everything from the design of containers to recycling messaging to federal policy improvements to help get us through the current storm. Thank you for coming to Nashville and participating in today's MRF Summit.
Thank you, David, and good morning, all. I'd like to start a little bit by just telling you about my role. So my name is Stephen Sikra, and I have the pleasure of working for the Procter Gamble company. I've been there for 27 years, and in my role, I get to focus on what I call end-of-life innovation. And it's a fantastic part of the journey in my career. Can I ask the slides to stop moving on their own, please? Perhaps we can back up a little bit. These are animated, but it's not me with the animation. So a little bit about Procter Gamble. We're a big company. We operate in 70 countries. We sell our brands in over 180. We sell a lot of product, but the most important concept I like to share is that we serve 5 billion consumers. And in so doing, we take great responsibility, and it's with the consumer in mind that we set our long-term sustainability vision. It's very simply to reduce our environmental footprint, and to enable consumers to be more sustainable. Now, in this regard, we focus on a vision where we get to 100% renewable or recycled materials, our plants being run by 100% renewable energy. We work to keep all of our materials out of landfill and providing consumers with sustainable solution. Now, you can't have a vision without time-based goals, so we have some. For 2020, we have a goal to reduce our packaging by 20%. Along that journey, we're at 14% reduced so far. We strive for 90% recyclable packaging. We're at 86% recyclable today. And we have striving goals to double our use of PCR towards our goal of 52,000 metric tons. We're at 34,000 metric tons today. And we have pilots in both developed and developing regions to help eliminate landfill and dumping. Whether it's a pure cycle project where we're recycling and decontaminating polypropylene, or the work we're doing with the material recovery of the future to pull the film out of the fiber stream and find homes for these new bales of material, or a waste-to-earth project that we're working in the Philippines, just as examples of some of the pilots that we're working on. For the year 2030, we've released 2 new goals of importance here. One is a 100% recyclable or reusable packaging, and a very ambitious goal by 2030 to halt the flow of P&G plastic to the ocean. Absolutely phenomenal effort. We're taking this quite seriously. We're evaluating some very major collaborative efforts to do this. I list the Asia Pacific Coalition and the Clean Ocean Fund as a couple of these innovative mechanisms that we look forward to using. As we progress along our journey, we keep a couple principles in mind. One is that innovation and collaboration is key, and we try to follow life cycle assessment process to be driven by data, science-based data, while we follow the waste management hierarchy. Across the focus areas, we have 5, starting with design, which is more than just optimizing materials, but it also includes new business models. We recognize we have a role in access to infrastructure. This is about bringing cash so we can have convenient access to recycling systems. We view ourselves as having a role in inspiring consumers to participate, providing them transparency in the materials that we use, enabling them with education and incentive programs. We also see a role that we play in separation and processing, innovating at 3 different levels, not just the macro level, separating glass from plastic from metal, but the micro level, polymer A from polymer B, for example, or even at the molecular level, whether it's a chemical-based recycling or solvent-based. We're working in that area as well. But probably the largest area that we play a role in addition to design, is on the back end in terms of providing that end market demand for post-consumer recycle. We believe it must be consistent, it must be year on year, and that type of annual growth is needed for our industry. We're happy to celebrate that we've been using PCR at P&G for 30 years, but the reality is we need to continue to work across the entire supply chain to do more and more in this regard. And I think it's in the context of this recycling value chain, whether it's the design on the front end or the supply components that I've talked about a little bit in terms of access or participation or processing, or finally in the end market demand, our role as a brand owner is to play across this entire value chain. And now we're ready to take your questions, and happy to sit down and hear what you would like us to talk about.
Nice.
Thank you.
Okay. Again, thank you all to all 3 of you for joining us this morning for this very important MRF Summit. I guess my first question would be, since this is such a fluid situation that we find ourselves in, what do you 3 think would be the most important recent developments when it comes to MRF and recycling?
I'm happy to start. I think there are developments on both the challenges side and the opportunities. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in the international markets that are being affected by these trade wars, whether it's between US and China, or also what's happening as a result of the 232s and the the tariffs that have been imposed on Turkey, that's further putting constraints on the system. China just announced that by 2020, there'll be an end to the imports of solid waste. Part of it's a definition issue. And we have this month the 50% tariffs on steel coming out of Turkey. On the opportunity side, there's a lot of collaborative efforts that have started. And I'm very excited about those, both within industry, but also with government. We've got a very active, there's a lot of very good active work being done through the Department of Energy on research and development for future of manufacturing, including recycling. So there's a lot of good things happening as well.
David, your thoughts?
Sure. So Robin's correct that there's a lot of activity happening at the governmental level. Just this week, Massachusetts announced a new program to try to help local governments deal with the current recycling challenges. The state of New York has started a stakeholder outreach program with meetings starting next week in Albany. So we're seeing some activity at the state level. On the international level, something that some people may not be aware of is that there's a proposal to amend something called the Basel Convention, this treaty that 150 countries have signed that governs the transboundary movement of hazardous material, not necessarily waste or scrap, but there's a proposal to include plastic in that convention, and that's going to be discussed in a couple of weeks over in Europe. And this is something that should be very concerning because it would require notification and before shipments are done, and would create a significant obstacle to transboundary trade in plastic material. It's being pushed by the government of Norway and has some measure of support from some countries. And as you might imagine, myself, Robin, and others have been in contact with the United States government to express our concerns about that.
Mm-hmm. We'll keep our eyes on that, yeah. Any comments?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think on the commitment side, we're seeing a major commitment moving forward from many brand owners, both in terms of design for recyclability and for PCR use. So I think that's an exciting change. We need to see that come much faster. But the other area that I think is exciting is in the area of innovation, and I mentioned a little bit about PureCycle technology. So Procter Gamble has this technology, but I also want to recognize Unilever has a technology as well as other companies coming forward with technical advances. Specific to PureCycle, it's about decontaminating recycled polypropylene. Today, if I want to buy polypropylene, unfortunately, it ranges from gray to black in color. And it's very hard, in fact, impossible for me to color that to the brand equity choices my consumers are looking for. So we need a technology such as this to bolt on the back of a mechanical recycling system that's going to take these polymers to that virgin level. So again, I think I'm excited about the commitments I see on design and demand, but these technical advances are ultra critical as well to get us to the quality that we need.
Now, you did mention design earlier as well. How can the recycling industry and local governments take part in that discussion?
Well, I would just mention that we have been for a long time been working with manufacturers, but we certainly need to expand our efforts into packaging because that's such an important part of the residential stream. And it's just a dialogue to make sure that there's understanding on both sides in terms of what the needs are. So what are the impediments that are occurring in the recycling process itself caused by design choices, so that as manufacturers and designers look at new designs, they can incorporate and look for solutions. And so it's an open dialogue that has to occur.
Yeah, and to build on that, I think what's fundamental is for all of us to embrace the design guidelines that are put forward by trade organizations such as ISRI, such as the APR, to partner with groups like the Recycling Partnership at the municipal level to institute these guidelines and best practices for consumer education, for inspiring recycling. And on the front end, of course, is designing for the recycling market. That's what we own within our shops. Choosing materials that there's a commodity end market for is the best way to get to a recyclable package.
And if I can build on that.
Sure.
I think one of the important things that's happening nowadays that I'm excited about, it's just beginning, is that over the last couple of years, there have been the development of these recyclability guidelines. And then we've also got the ISRI specs on the demand side, but they haven't been connected. But now there's discussions about how we do that because there will we're never going to be successful unless we connect the two. It has to make it through the stream, and there has to be the market on the other end. So by connecting them, we'll be much more successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add that I think local governments have not provided as much feedback to manufacturers about the types of design choices and what's not working in the MRF. I think we need to institutionalize that feedback loop somehow through this collaborative effort and have a stronger voice in that dialogue that's taking place. Because I think we have a voice, but I don't think it's a particularly strong voice.
Mm-hmm. And also, David, earlier you mentioned contamination, and you just mentioned local governments. What are the local governments and facilities doing to reduce that contamination?
It's been a struggle. Some local governments are, have I said in my opening remarks, they've slowed the line down. They've added labor. You hire more people to take out the stuff that you don't want going through the line. Or you buy more optical sorters. As Ron Mittelstadt said yesterday, the technology has advanced very significantly over the last 5 years. And we've seen some companies accelerate their investment in equipment to get the contamination rate down lower, not as low as 0.5%, but lower. MRFs have a role to play in communicating to their haulers. Haulers have a role to play in communicating to their customers. We need to do a better job of educating the consumer. I suspect we'll talk about that a little bit later. But we really do need to focus like a laser on reducing contamination, both from the residential stream as well as in public spaces. I travel a lot. Every time I'm in a national airport in Washington, I go over and look at the recycling bins, and I'm appalled at what I see.
Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned what MRFs are doing. One of our audience questions actually is, what are the 3 main ways a MRF can take advantage of a down market, and further, how can a MRF improve processes, business practices, et cetera?
Well, producing a higher quality bale is the best way for a MRF to take advantage of a down market. That might mean having to process mixed paper more than once. That might mean having to accelerate investment in equipment. But there are buyers out there, domestic and overseas, for quality material. And it would be the main way to take advantage of a down market.
Okay. Let's talk about markets. At the end of the day, it's pretty much all about markets. And having a market for the material being diverted, what can we do to ensure that we do have healthier markets for scraps and recyclables?
Well, there are a couple of things. One of the things that ISRI is doing is communicating with other governments about the availability of scrap, the ISRI specifications, and having them adopt those specifications in order to ensure that their manufacturers can get the grades of scrap that they need. So we've been spending a lot of time working with other governments. We were just in India. Our ISRI chair, who's here, Brian Chine, was in India at a summit that was held there for 2 days with the heads of the ministries of the various parts of the Indian government as well as Indian industry as they're developing a national recycling policy. And part of the discussion was where the markets are and the ISRI specs and how they fit in to make sure the standards are in place to ensure that healthy market.
Stephen, any comments on that?
I'm watching the questions on the screen here, and there's one that just keeps popping up that begs for
All right, you're looking at our screen, and which question are you referring to?
The top one, does Procter & Gamble support EPR legislation? Seems to be a lot of interest in that. So
Can
I'm
you give us some background on that?
Yeah, so let's just define EPR, extended producer responsibility, for those who may not know. At Procter & Gamble, we certainly look at the responsibility aspect, number one. So we take responsibility for our packages and products throughout the supply chain. I hope you've seen that from my brief introduction. In terms of extended producer responsibility or voluntary producer responsibility, we participate in both. So in areas where EPR is in place today, and EPR defined as what? It's those fees, those regulations, those dollars that we're asked to pay based on the tonnage of material by type in a particular country or region. That's how I define EPR. There's various mechanisms for EPR to be rolled out, and I think folks would generally agree not one EPR system is the same. What we do know is that we'd like to have a seat at the table. We bring an area of expertise, certainly not across the entire value chain, but components of it. So whether it's an EPR system or a VPR system, we take responsibility, we want to participate, and we recognize the simple need is this: recycling is nowhere near the rate where it should be anywhere in the world. And so we need to continually improve in this area and maintain that responsibility, whether it's an EPR or a VPR system.
David, any thoughts on this kind of legislation?
So SWANA believes that, you know, state and local governments are best positioned to determine what the appropriate level and type of regulation is. And so what might work in one state or province might not work in another. And so we have provinces in particular where EPR is taking place. It's not as popular in the United States. Mm-hmm. We need certainly more voluntary activity in this area, and look forward to encouraging Amazon and other large consumers of paper in particular to ensure more require more use of post-consumer product.
Now, what do you think, Robin?
I would just add that from the recycling industry perspective, we've been very market-oriented, and we don't believe in the need for EPR unless it's really absolutely necessary to support a market, and then as soon as possible, it should disappear once the market is healthy enough. But I think that there are other legislative alternatives we could turn to, and other ways we can engage the government to help support the industry. One of the things that a number of us in the recycling chain are involved in is the debate over infrastructure reform, for example, and seeing if we can utilize infrastructure reform to help with investments here domestically to help get the demand side as well as the supply side working a lot better.
Right, right. Also, we have another for Procter & Gamble, a question from the audience. When Procter & Gamble works on new packaging, and I'm assuming this is directed at you, Steve, is there conversation with MRFs as to how they will recover that material?
Indeed there is, and in fact we're informed from a couple of different sources. Mm-hmm. So I'm based in Cincinnati, Ohio, and Rumpke Recycling is the pertinent operator in our area. Ben Pettigo and I have conversations routinely. We run trials in his shop from time to time, and so we get good guidance from Ben on what works in his particular area. But more importantly, we're aware that no MRF is the same across the region, across the state. So we're also informed by a MRF group within the Association of Plastic Recyclers. They have a MRF committee that helps inform us. But let me not be trite. Let me recognize the MRFs are the last to find out about our new designs. I get that. And there's a reason, right? Because as a brand company, we want to be on the shelf first with our new product and our new idea. The good news is we're informed by the guidelines of the recycling industry. We're informed by knowledgeable relationships that we have with the MRFs. That is a factor in our decision-making process for design, and it's one that we take very seriously.
Yes, David.
I'm glad that you acknowledge that the MRFs are the last ones to find out, because I think that's a concern that I have. I know that when my kids were young and we used to go to Saturday soccer games, some parent always had to bring the Capri Suns. And that was my first introduction to flexible packaging, right? And that was 10, 15 years ago. And now there's a zillion consumer products in flexible packaging, tuna fish and a whole bunch of other things. And some consumers are thinking that material is recyclable in current MRF operations. And I think for too long, large brands, and I'm not putting Procter & Gamble in this category, but I think large brands have externalized the cost of disposal of the containers onto the MRFs and onto the waste sector. And I think we need to stop that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Robin.
And if I can also add to this discussion, there's actually a good model out there about how we can do better. Back in the 90s, and I'm now dating myself, I was very young when I started. In the 90s, there was a group called the Vehicle Recycling Partnership, because then the big issue was the automobiles. And actually, we had similar discussions with the appliance manufacturers. And there was this vehicle recycling partnership based in Detroit that met every couple of months for discussions between the recycling community, the manufacturers, the auto manufacturers, the OEMs, and the whole supply chain, as well as Argonne National Labs at the time, so DOE was involved, to talk about what was in that car. And to talk about what was coming down the line, because I agree with David, we're often the last ones to know. And we don't like to be surprised. There's some really bad examples in history of how we've been surprised by materials that show up in the stream. And so we would welcome some sort of concerted effort with the brand owners, the packaging industry, et cetera, to have some sort of similar discussions. And I know our MRF Council is very excited about that kind of discussion and would very much look forward to it.
Stephen, any final comments on that topic?
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely. You know, I shared a little bit on the life cycle analysis in the waste management hierarchy. And the reality is there is a move from rigid to flexible packaging. And there's a good compelling reason for that. It's not just consumer demand. It's not just convenience to feed your kids at the park, right? But it's also about a lower impact on the environment. And overall, flexible packaging is lighter weight than rigid packaging. It has lower greenhouse gases. It requires less energy. And when you do a full study across that life cycle, it is a better impact for the environment, but we can't stop there. We have to have the and component of that, and we want to drive recovery in end markets. And there was a question in Arturo, if you don't mind.
Sure.
How does Procter & Gamble define recycling or recyclability? I think we might all have a consistent answer here. It's not just collection or the ability to process, but it's coupling that with a good end market at scale that works when people aren't looking at it. So we define a recyclable package as one where there is access, collection, separation, and end markets operating in a major region. That's our definition of recyclable packaging. And you know, if I separate films into two classes for a minute, that clean, dry polyolefin film that's used as a wrap has a much stronger end market than the multi-layer package. We understand that. But we need to help find homes and ways to fulfill the needs across the supply chain for all of those. There's benefits to cleaning up the paper stream by pulling the film out. We also think there's a benefit to finding homes for these bales that are newly built and formed, and we're playing some roles to do just that.
And Robin, you're agreeing with his definition of recycling?
Absolutely.
Recyclables.
And I also want to acknowledge that we fully understand and appreciate that there are many factors in the design choices that are made. Recycling is only one element. There's cost, there's energy savings. There's a number of different issues you're looking at. And I think all we're asking for is to be part of the discussion and a factor in those decisions. Okay.
There we go. Historic moment right there, folks. I do want to get to
just a bit. Robin and I do talk, by the way.
Okay.
Right?
I've had a question from the audience that's been up here for quite a while from Phil. And Phil is asking, how long do you think it will take for domestic mills or demand to come online? David?
So we've seen an uptick in interest in creating new capacity here in the United States. There's been both mills being opened as well as investment from overseas in existing mills and expanding them. I think that is going to accelerate as if we see the continued strong U.S. economy, as well as the continuation and acceleration of Chinese restrictions on material going overseas. The unfortunate thing, as most of you in the audience know, is that you can't just turn a switch and open up a paper mill, right? It takes years to identify property, construct, permit, et cetera, get equipment. I think Ron Middlestat mentioned this yesterday. You know, he was looking mid-19 is when we would start to see a significant acceleration, and I don't see anything on my horizon that would be different from that.
Thoughts on this, Robin?
No, I agree. It is going to take time. I mean, we're talking about 30% of the stream that needs to find new markets. And so it's not going to happen overnight, and there isn't one solution. We're excited about some of the investment that's being made in the US. We want to see more of it, but there's got to be multiple solutions.
Okay. And I think we do have time for one more question here from the audience. Is now a bad time to retrain the public about what is in and out of a recycling bin?
It's never a bad time.
Never a bad time, right.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. I think we have gotten a little, perhaps, lazy, okay? When single stream came out, we had lots of posters and lots of communications, and we relied on those to educate the consumer, but consumer behavior has changed, the packaging stream has changed, and we need to educate people about what goes in the blue bin and what does not go in the blue bin. We're working with a number of organizations to try to develop new communications around that issue. It's really important for local governments, because they're to be at the tip of the spear on this, to be communicating to their residents, to be letting them know through digital, through print, on the container, etc. Here's what belongs in the bin. Here's the condition it should be in the bin. Here's what does not belong in the bin. Plastic bags and garden hoses do not belong in the bin.
All right, thank you. And we do have a question that's being pushed up to the top here. Why have biodegradable plastics not replaced recyclable materials in Procter & Gamble's packaging?
It's a great question. Let me go back again to the waste management hierarchy that I referenced before. So both the EPA and the European Commission, and frankly many governments around the world, have adopted this waste management hierarchy, which really shows end-of-life solutions relative to their impact on the environment. And we know that at the top of that pyramid, the absolute best with the least impact on the environment is to reduce the amount of materials, followed by reuse and refill, and then recycling. Recycling and composting, depending when you look at the hierarchy, may be rated in the same area, but frankly, the composting and biodegradability is focused on food. Not food packaging, but food and organics. And why we focus on the recycling of materials is because we see it as a valuable commodity, a valuable raw material that we can use it again and again and again. So my argument is simply this, that biodegradable packaging, it offers at best a second life, right? If indeed we believe it becomes true nutrients for the soil. The reality is, for biodegradability and composting to work, you typically need good industrial composting environments, and we don't have that many in the US. So we're going to strive for more recycling than more biodegradability. The other thing, and this is proven with very concrete data from multiple sources, that consumers react differently when you see something that's marked biodegradable. Sadly, it tends to promote litter. So rather than enticing someone to recycle or put it in an accepted solid waste container, it does promote littering behavior. And that's because there's a misconception that if you put this on the ground in a couple of days, it's going to disappear into nothing. That's not the reality.
David, your thoughts on that?
I actually was thinking about something slightly different than that. I'm concerned about that consumer behavior, but it goes to another issue that I think we need to keep in mind here. We need to not just recycle better, we need to produce less. We need to be generating less waste. Local governments should be actively talking about waste reduction and not just figuring out what goes in the bin. Part of how we've gotten into this situation is we got reliant on China. We got reliant on China because it was an outlet for a third of the recyclable material in the United States. Those chickens are coming home to roost now, and one of the solutions here is actually generating less waste.
What is the key to starting that conversation with governments, David?
Oh, that's a complicated question.
Yeah,
we'll have to have a separate breakout for that one.
Okay, I think we have run out of time apparently. We do want to get some final thoughts from our panelists. Stephen, I'm going to start with you.
You know, I'd like folks to walk away that companies like Procter & Gamble are playing a role. We recognize we have responsibility in this space. The responsibility is across the entire value chain, not just the design, but through the infrastructure to the end market demand. We can't do this alone. As Robin said, there is no silver bullet. Collaboration is absolutely key to this, as well as commitment to year-on-year participation in improving the supply chain. So we're here to play our role, we're here to listen, we're here to learn, and we're here to do more.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephen. Robin?
Certainly collaboration is key. And again, we're grateful for everyone who's here, and we're looking forward to some very good dialogue over the next 2 days. I just want to mention one other point, though. Words matter, language matters, and one of the things that I've been increasingly concerned about is that there's all this talk about recycling is in crisis, recycling is collapsing, whatever the terms are that are using. The countries are saying they don't want our waste, our garbage. Recyclables, successful recycling, when it works, and it works very well. We have a very strong infrastructure here in the US that has worked for many years and continues to be very vibrant. But successful recycling results in commodity-grade materials that are products. They're not waste materials. And people are listening to us. Other countries are listening to us. And the way we talk about what we're doing is going to be reflected in what comes back to us. And so we have to be very careful about how we talk about what we're all doing.
Thank you. And David?
It's nice to get the last word. I agree with my fellow panelists. This is a multivariable equation. There's no silver bullet here. We need to collaborate. We need to continue to have conversations like this in formal settings like this and in informal settings. SWANA is very focused on the great challenge that municipal recycling programs face in both the United States and Canada. We're working on a number of fronts in this area. We've recently, we're going through a process of changing our technical policy on how you measure recycling. Is weight the only way to be measuring recycling? Does that make sense in a universe where there's light weighting? We're working through our recycling task force on the best ideas for reducing contamination, which is clearly a central part of this dilemma that we're in. We're very interested in creating more demand for post-consumer product, and thrilled to hear about some of the activities that you have going on at Procter Gamble in that area. And as Robin mentioned, there's policy opportunities for us both in Washington, D.C., where we are striving to have funding for recycling included in the infrastructure bill. And when we talk to people on the Hill about that, it's not about the environment. It's about jobs. Recycling is a job generator. So when you go back to your communities and you speak to the media and you speak to people in your offices and you speak to state officials and you speak to local government other local government representatives and your federal representatives, let them know that there's a jobs program out there. It's not quite the New Deal, but it's going to be pretty significant. There's a lot of jobs out there if we can create domestic recycling programs at the level that we need them to be. And if we do so, we will help address this dilemma very, very significantly.
David, thank you. I guess before we wrap things up, Robin, you had a quick announcement to make.
Yes, I just wanted to share with everyone that we're having a slight change in the schedule this morning. Because of the storms on the East Coast, one of our speakers, the speaker for our next session, Barnes Johnson, unfortunately, after spending, I think, 10 hours at the airport, could not leave the airport and arrive here. So we're going to go straight into breakout sessions. So I think what we're going to ask everyone to do when this is over, those of you who are still being part of the MRF Summit, and hopefully that's most of you, we're going to gather near the registration area and then talk about which breakout sessions everyone's going to go into.
Excellent. Okay, and I do want to say a final thank you to our panelists here. Can we give them a round of applause, please?
Good job, Robin. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen Silka. Thank you, Robin Wiener, and thank you, David Biderman. And we also want to say a final thank you to the MRF Summit sponsors, Republic Services and Resource Recycling Systems. And thank you all so very much for joining us.